A mi alrededor ángeles con coros celestiales me van cantando y yo voy gritando, de lo más hondo de mi alma exclamo: Dios, 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 gracias. Ay, We weren't born to suffer, that's what this song says. Yo no he nacido para sufrir. Sincero con las mujeres del pueblo, cariñoso, sincero, libre, soltero, jilguero, lindo, moreno, soltero, libre, soltero, jilguero, lindo, moreno, soltero, lindo, moreno, soltero, lindo, moreno, soltero. Conseguir cuando me falta dinero, trabajo duro conseguir cuando me falta dinero, lo suficiente para vivir y una morena para dormir, lo suficiente para vivir y una morena para dormir, una morena para dormir, una morena para dormir.
Thank you.
Alright, the next song is cueca. It's a traditional dance that it's very popular in South America. But in Bolivia, we dance to celebrate an encounter between couples. This cueca is called el regreso, which means
The comeback.
and the lyrics talk about when you come back from other parts of the world to Bolivia, the feeling that you have when you close. This is called el regreso y cuequita boliviana y se va la primerita.
Yo regreso, ya te tengo en mi mirada, te contemplo en tu infinito, mis montañas recordadas, te contemplo en tu infinito, mis montañas recordadas, desde lejos, desde aquellos horizontes que se escapan, hoy regreso a tu infinito, Pachamama, Pachamama. Pachamama, Pachamama, yo no logro explicarme con qué cadenas me atas, con qué hierbas me cautivas, dulce tierra boliviana, con qué hierbas me cautivas, dulce tierra boliviana. Yo regreso a tus tierras trabajadas por titanes ignorados que cobijan la altipampa, por titanes ignorados que cobijan la altipampa. Desde lejos como el viento traigo nombres de otras patrias, pero busco en tu infinito las raíces de mi alma. Las raíces de mi alma, yo no logro explicarme con qué cadenas me atas, con qué hierbas me cautivas, dulce tierra boliviana, con qué hierbas me cautivas, dulce tierra boliviana. Eso, ay, la, ay, la, ay, la, ay, la.
Thank you guys so much. My name is Freddy Larrosa, and I'm from Ecuador, but I've been so blessed to be a part of this Bolivian folk group, KLANDESTINO, Roots and Culture. And not only do they play strictly Bolivian roots and culture, but they do bring this Andean South American folk music to your consideration. And personally, I'm working on my first album right now. It's called Children of the Light. I'm going to be releasing it on Saturday, February 8th in Hoboken, New Jersey. And it's such a pleasure to be here with my brothers. And we're actually going to play a couple of songs off that original album. One of the songs is in Spanish. This song is called Reflejo. And it's precisely that. It's a mirror of the way that we feel and how we sometimes feel completely overwhelmed with life and sad with life, but we still keep moving forward, right? So we look in that mirror and we see all these things, but we keep moving forward with it. So that's what this song is about. I hope you all enjoy it. I'm still very low on the guitar. Can I get a little bit more volume on it, please? Please, and thank you. Yeah, that'll do. Thank you.
Mis pensamientos me enloquecen, la quietud me enloquece, algo que no quiero ver se asoma, y tengo miedo de ver y de ser. Las ilusiones son cadenas, tenemos miedo a ser libres, libres de verdad. ¿Qué es la libertad? ¿Qué es la tristeza y la alegría? ¿Dónde encuentro la felicidad? Todo es pasajero aquí en lo terrenal. ¿Dónde encuentro la tranquilidad? Que nada tenga ya sentido y todo significa tanto, que no escuchemos más al viento, al mar, la naturaleza, que seamos causa de maldades y no queremos ser la solución, en el amor, que no sabemos lo que es el amor. ¿Dónde encuentro la felicidad? Todo es pasajero aquí en lo terrenal. ¿Dónde encuentro la tranquilidad? ¿Dónde está la paz en esta oscuridad? Que estemos solos entre tantos. La programación de la radio y la televisión, la destrucción de las mentes, de nuestra nación, del medio ambiente, de nuestra casa y nuestros cuerpos, del tráfico de la ciudad. Habiendo tanto mar por navegar, de la pobreza, habiendo tanta riqueza, del egoísmo que hay en mí y que se refleja en otros, que no querramos ver la magia de existir, que no sabemos ser felices y hacerlo para otros. Pero yo voy a seguirlo intentando. Siempre vamos a intentarlo. Y aquí encuentro la felicidad.
cantando. The actual release for the album is on all platforms and media is February 17th. The album release party will be on February 8th. If you guys want to follow that and come to that show, you can find me on your Instagram or Facebook or your social media as Larrosa Music, L-A-R-R-O-S-A Music. One word. Thank you guys so much for that. We're going to do one more original and then finish off with some Bolivian. This one's actually in English, and it's got the title of the album. It's called Children of the Light, and we share this with a lot of love. Ready, familia? One, two, tres, see your eyes, they're lost behind the smiles, you start to cry. But no, you're not alone, your wandering soul can count on I and I. Jah knows we've suffered and the roads we walk will make us wise. Who you are, remember you're the light, you are divine, you are the stars, you are the sun, you are the moonlight, you're the one who bring you closer to the sky. Feel how the rhythms they collide, so try your eyes and live your life, open your wings and learn to fly. And I am the moon, and I am the trees and the birds and the busy bees. I am nature and evolution, and I am time and rhythm and movement, and I am the now. I am that I am. I am. I am that I am. I am. You are the greatest story ever told. So raise your hands in glory and behold the miracle of life as it unfolds before your eyes. Oh, don't waste away your time. Come back to the light. You are divine. Oh, no, no. You are the stars, you are the sun, you are the moonlight, you're the one who bring you closer to the sky. Feel how the rhythms they collide, so try your eyes and live your life, open your wings and learn to fly. these fantastic, wonderful musicians. Thank you. David Alejandro Moreno from Colombia. José Ponce from Bolivia. Pablo Pantoja from Bolivia. Thank you guys. ¿Qué tenemos? Señora Chicha.
For the last song, we're gonna perform un tinku, which means battle between two cities. They confront each other dancing, and the rhythm is very upbeat beating. So what they do is they dance and they fight at the same time. So, but we don't want that here, all right? We take the battle to other extremes, like what are you guys doing here, fighting and expressing what you guys feel for us, and we thank you very much. This is called Señora Chichera.
Digan ustedes. ¿Moliendo café? Necesito hacer Alright, we're gonna jam a little bit on this one. See what happens. This is called Moliendo Café. ¿De dónde es originalmente esa canción? Colombia en Venezuela, Moliendo Café.
En la quietud los cafetales vuelven a sentir una triste canción de amor de la vieja molienda. Del atargo de la noche parece decir, cuando la tarde languidece renace las sombras. En la quietud los cafetales vuelven a sentir una triste canción de amor de la vieja molienda. En el letargo de la noche parece decir una pena de amor, una tristeza. De bálsamo Manuel en su amargura, pasa incansable la noche moliendo café. De la noche moliendo café.
Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima. Thank you so much.
Another round of applause for Clandestino Roots and I'm the chairperson of Brooklyn for Peace, and I want to welcome you all tonight and thank you very much for coming. So I'm limited at the moment to introducing Natasha Santos, our new program coordinator, who will take over the program from here. So I hope you'll all welcome Natasha, and here she is.
So thank you so much for that warm welcome, Charlotte. And can we have one more hand for Clandestino? They were amazing. Thank you so I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight to our forum, What's Happening in Bolivia and Why It Matters. Thank you, Melissa and August and Calla, she's headed out, and the rest of the Common staff for hosting us. Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor that the land on which we gather here tonight is seized and occupied territory of the Lenape people, who stewarded this land for generations. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and ask that we all take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, and settlement that brings us here today. So please just take a few moments of silence with me. Thank you. Thank you guys. It's really important to acknowledge that and acknowledge it together. A bit of background. Brooklyn for Peace has been working in Brooklyn since 1984. We are a democratically functioning, nonpartisan group. We are committed to eliminating war and the social injustices that are its causes. Through active education on international and domestic issues, we empower our community and ourselves to be a productive force in securing a peaceful future for generations to come. We'd also like to thank all the organizations who have co-sponsored this event. The Center for Cuban Studies, the NACLA, Peace Action Bay Ridge, I keep putting it on the clipboard. Peace Action New York State, U.S. Labor Against the War, the New York City chapter, and the Veterans for Peace, the New York City chapter 034. I'd also like to tell you guys about upcoming events. We're doing Wrestling with Zionism, which will take place on Thursday, March 19th at the Park Slope United Methodist Church. The flyers on the event are over there on our information table, so please check it out and also check out the other information that we have. We really appreciate everyone that can show up and show out. I'd also like to let you know we're recording this event and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you would prefer not to be recorded, let us know and we'll make sure. WBAI also may be broadcasting this event as well, so just let us know how you feel about that. And finally, if you can and would like to support the work we do by making a donation, please do so in the baskets that are being passed around by Molly and Sam. And next up is one of the main people that planned this entire event. Please give a warm, big applause for Ambia.
Credit card, Bitcoin.
Hold on. But the applause is still there. We still love you.
Matthew Weinstein here from Brooklyn for Peace. Can I have your attention for 5 seconds? I'm going to make this really quick. How many of you know that there is a City Council resolution number 747A pending inside the New York City Council right now? Raise your hands. Okay, a lot of you don't. This is a question about our city, our neighbors, you and me, and social programs of human need, jobs, housing, fixing our subways, cleaning our streets and repairing them, and our bridges and our roadways, so on and so forth. That the City Council, year in and year out, bicker over crumbs because we are sending billions of dollars to Washington, where the Congress then, this year, in December, just now, $738 billion for these endless wars, for for overthrowing regimes in Latin America, for having the CIA, or for assassinating, generals in sovereign countries, so on and so forth, or for rebuilding our nuclear force, weapons that can never and must never ever be used, to the tune of $1 trillion over the next 10 years. So what we're talking about here is a resolution that will not be binding on the Congress, but isn't it about time that our city go on the record to move the money from war to our communities? That's what this resolution, I want you to all remember, it's the same number as a jumbo jet, 747A. So I want you to, Sam here, hold them up. We have postcards. These are addressed to your city council members. You fill it out, but you give it back to us so we can track how many each city council member gets. Please print legibly, because we can't get your address and your email into our database, and then to tell Council Member Lori Cumbo, who has refused to sign this so far. But we do have 16 council members who have signed it out of 51, so there's a big job to do. Again, sign the postcard, go on to the City Council website, find out who your council member is, tell them you want 747A passed in 2020. Thank you very much. Move the money.
Okay, I used to be an after-school counselor, so watch this. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. If you can hear my voice, clap 3 times. If you hear my voice, listen. I want to introduce really quickly Fawcett Ambia. She is a retired public interest attorney and longtime peace and social justice activist. Amazing woman. She is a member of the board of directors at Brooklyn for Peace and also serves on its Peace and Economic Justice Committee. Anne has extended family in Bolivia and has been there several times. Her last visit was in 2014 as a member of the National Lawyers Guild, which participated in an international delegation of trained election observers for the 2014 national election, which Evo Morales won without dispute. Anne wrote a short article on the coup in Bolivia in November, which can be found on the Brooklyn for Peace website. That's brooklynforpeace.org. The last paragraph of this article was adopted by the board as Brooklyn for Peace's position statement on Bolivia. This statement can be found on the back of the flyer that was placed on your chair. So, one more time, and for real this time, because she's going to speak, give a big, warm applause for Anne Ambia.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody, again. And before I forget, I want to thank Natasha and Charlotte Phillips, especially for all the help that they gave in setting this up. And also, thank you to everyone who came tonight to help out. So, before I introduce our first speaker, I want to let you know what the format of tonight's event will be and just lay some basic ground rules for us all to follow. With that in mind, I'd like to ask, how many people here are Bolivian and or have family and friends living in Bolivia? So, how many people are here for the first time at a Brooklyn for Peace event? Yes, fantastic as well.
Welcome, welcome.
Yes, welcome everybody. Okay, the format will be the following. Our 2 invited speakers will talk for 20 minutes each to lay a foundation for discussion. And after that, I will be moderating a dialogue between them and you, in which you will have an opportunity to briefly express your viewpoint and to ask questions. We up here are not necessarily going to fully agree with each other, nor do we expect that all of you will agree with everything you hear. However, we do expect this event to be a safe space in which we maintain a conversational and respectful tone, and we ask everyone to be mindful of the fact that some of us in this room are personally affected by what is going on in Bolivia. There is no one-size-fits-all analysis that can be applied to the specific conditions within any country, and Bolivia is no exception. What we hope will come out of this event is that we will all have a better understanding of the complexities of what's happening in Bolivia and an alternative view to what has been presented to us by U.S. corporate media, and I should say by the coup media in Bolivia as well. Thank you. Our first speaker will be Zeeshan Aleem. who is a columnist for Vice and freelance political reporter whose work has been published in The Nation, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Esquire, Vox, Politico, HuffPost, Pacific Standard, and elsewhere. In the past, he has taught a course about media and politics as an adjunct professor at the New School and served as a staff reporter for several news outlets. He studied at George Washington University and Oxford University for his undergraduate degree in American Studies and holds a master's degree in sociology from the University of Chicago. And I would like to add, Zeeshan spent a month in Bolivia in which he spoke to a number of people, and 3 of the articles that he posted, that he has published in The Nation, are about the situation in Bolivia.
So thanks, Anne, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Brooklyn for Peace for putting on this very important event, which is also incredibly timely. So before I get into sort of the heart of my remarks, I want to give a little bit of background on my coverage of the situation in Bolivia. So last spring, as Anne mentioned, I spent about a month in Bolivia. I traveled through about half a dozen towns and cities throughout the country, and I spoke to people from a variety of backgrounds in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class, in terms of ideological background, and my main intention was to sort of assess and sort of measure how Bolivia's socialist experiment had gone, about 13 to 14 years in. And what I found was there was a big split between the economic and political spheres of life there. On the issue of the economy, there was a near total consensus across the ideological spectrum, across the different kinds of people who spoke to it, that the economy was in incredible shape and had been transformed by Evo Morales, who came to power in 2005 and was part of the left-wing pink tide that swept across Latin America in the 2000s. And sort of was the last man standing of the pink tide, effectively, because the rest of that pink tide had ebbed, and the rest of the region had swung, not entirely, but much of it further to the right. So on the economic side of things, people were very, there was this consensus that the average Bolivian, and most notably indigenous Bolivians from poor backgrounds, had benefited enormously from an economy that was a lot more inclusive. There was the institution of a robust welfare state, a reversal of privatization of natural resources, so they're funneled towards people. And there's also a general belief, even among conservatives, that the technical handling of the economy on things like exchange rate, on monitoring of inflation, and on issues like developing savings was handled quite well. And so what's interesting is that you have Morales as sort of an icon of left-wing politics and would widely be perceived as an ideologue, but the people he employed to run the economy were respected across the political spectrum for being careful, for what could be called prudent populism, as Santiago Anria of Dickinson College has said to me. So that was the economic side of things. On the political side of things, things were significantly different, in the sense that there was a big split on whether or not Evo Morales should be running for a 4th term last fall. A lot of this centered on the fact that in 2016, Morales held a referendum asking whether or not he could scrap constitutional term limits. He lost that referendum, but he took his case to the courts, and a constitutional tribunal won the right to run again, and they decided to run anyway. So this was hugely controversial. Some people thought of this as, while it was legal, there was a lot of concern about whether or not, well, this seemed to be disrespecting the sort of democratic spirit of the referendum, of the country as a whole. And so this was very divisive, and it's not just only people who always hated Morales who sided on one side of this. It split people across ideology, across geographic background. When I spoke to indigenous people in rural areas in the Altiplano, they expressed mixed feelings. There is still support for Morales that was still in those regions, but it was declining. And particularly in urban areas, particularly among young people, and particularly among the middle class, there was a sense that they had been sort of disenfranchised by the fact that he was choosing to run again anyway. So I basically emphasize this because I want to say that heading into the elections, the situation in Bolivia was very complicated. And the events that transpired last fall in October, November, themselves are also tremendously complex. So I want to encourage those of us in the US to really try to embrace that complexity when thinking about the situation and how to help, and to avoid the temptation to succumb to reductive or simplistic views of the situation. There is a temptation to just look at everything as an extension of Cold War politics, for example, or look at everyone as a piece in the balance of forces between the left and the right in the international arena. But that can be, well, in some ways regressive, because it might involve actually eclipsing the way that people on the ground think about things themselves. So I encourage people to think about what's going on in Bolivia and understand it on its own terms and paying attention to what citizens are saying. So broadly speaking, I want to touch, we're going to get more into the details over the course of the conversation. Pamela's going to, I'm sure, say lots of great stuff, but right for now I just want to focus, broadly speaking, on why I think we should interpret what happened as a coup, and why it's also more complicated than just a coup, and it's bigger than a coup, and what the implications of that are for people on the left in the US. So regarding the point of why this should be understood as a coup, there were, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this sort of basic chronology of what happened between the election on October 20th and Evo Morales' ouster on November 10th, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. So I'm going to point out key features as we go along, and I assume that there's already lots of, we can get into the details later, or you've done your own background research. But after weeks of massive protests and national unrest, I think one of the key things that really definitively means that we should understand this as a coup is the military intervention. Specifically the idea that the head of the armed forces, quote unquote, suggested that Morales step down. I think this set in motion what would be a non-democratic and unconstitutional transfer of power. The notion that it was a suggestion, I think, is a little bit absurd, because if you have the disposal, if you have all of the armed forces at your disposal, it's not really a suggestion. Another way of thinking about it is, if someone points a gun at your head and they politely tell you to do something, is it really a suggestion? Can you be said to have free will? So I would say no. Another issue which raises the question of unconstitutional, non-democratic transfer of power are the attacks on high-level members of the MAS in the days leading up to and the final day when Morales resigned. Specifically, most notably, you had attacks on the houses and family members of, the President of the Senate and the President of the Chamber of Deputies, the number 3 and the number 4, in line to the presidency after Morales and the Vice President. And those resignations came under duress. It's unclear whether or not, if you take the, the variable of the attacks away, it's possible they resigned because they thought, okay, well, it's all over for MAS, we need to leave. But because there were attacks on their houses, that complicates the analysis, and we can't say that they had free will when they left, because they were fearing for their lives. Another issue is the fact that there have been audio recordings leaked by the MAS to Airball and other other media outlets that indicate that ex-military and opposition politicians in Bolivia were discussing a range of tactics to overthrow Morales' government before it happened. I've spoken to a number of experts on this, and the recordings are considered legit. I've not heard anyone sort of dispute whether the authenticity of these things. The debate that's going on right now among the scholars that I've spoken to, and I haven't spoken to Pamela, but I'm sure she has many wise things to say about this, is that there's a debate about how definitively, what this really means for how we understand what degree of planning was going on. And there's a range of opinions on that. It's also worth pointing out there's signs of foreign meddling. So the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has documented the creation of nearly 70,000 fake Twitter accounts in the run-up to and after the coup. We don't know yet about all the origins of these accounts, but they obviously suggest some sort of shady action, and it could potentially be a sign of foreign meddling. The other thing is there's been now reports of the National Endowment for Democracy funneling over $1 million to opposition groups and potentially opposition parties in Bolivia over the course of 4 years. So obviously there is, for those who don't know the National Endowment for Democracy, it's a Washington-based NGO. It's partially funded or largely funded by Congress. So that is definitely going to reflect Washington's political or geopolitical interest in the region. And then lastly, I'd point out that the OAS, the Organization of American States, played a major role in destabilizing the Morales government. In particular, the timing of its documents and some of the claims that it made range from either questionable to outright indefensible. The consensus among experts I've spoken to is that there were irregularities in the election, and extensive irregularities, but there is not a consensus on whether or not those irregularities constitute fraud and whether or not those irregularities would actually have tipped the election in favor of Morales, which is to say it's not clear that they had a definitive effect on the outcome. And we can probably discuss more, and Pamela will probably weigh in on what she thinks about the issue of fraud, but that's a debate among political scientists I've spoken to. There does seem to be pretty legit indication of at least small-scale fraudulent action, but not widespread necessarily, and not at the national level. So it's clear that there is a complete disruption of the democratic process. What's less clear is the exact nature of the coup. Was there one leader or cadre that was orchestrating all this? The experts that I speak to say there isn't conclusive evidence of that. Instead, there seems to be the possibility of a range of different actors who exploited a very fluid situation and acted somewhat spontaneously, and also activated forces that they were planning beforehand as well. So to get at the sort of messiness of this, I'll give you a few examples. For example, the attacks on the Mas officials. When I spoke to Catherine Lederer of the Andean Information Network, who's very well connected and has her finger on the pulse of all this stuff, she told me that she didn't think that all the attacks that were happening on Mas officials were necessarily coordinated. She thinks the release of information specifically about the addresses of Mas officials may have been sent out in a coordinated way, but she said she didn't think all the attacks were coordinated. Jorge Durpic, mentioned at the University of Georgia, has pointed out that some of the attacks on, it's not that much time. Well, I'll probably skip around then. The Mas officials, some of them seem to be targeted and probably, may have come from right-wing forces, but specifically pointing out that some of them seem to be spontaneous mobs in response to, or meant to be retribution for attacks from Mas activists, particularly in Potosi. And then I'd also point out the fact that there isn't total unity on the right in Bolivia. For instance, Luis Camacho, who's a right-wing demagogue who had a meteoric rise in the run-up to the coup, is running, now is set to run for president against Janine Áñez, who's an interim president of Bolivia currently, and they would be obviously vying for right-wing votes. So basically, yes, that's point of unity. So I'm going to skip around, so I'll try to go quickly through the fact that the role of the U.S. seems to be unclear. Covert operations by the CIA, when I posed this question to experts, and I've spoken to about a dozen experts over the course of my reporting and in the run-up to our event here, obviously by definition a lot of it is unknowable. So we don't necessarily know what's going on covertly, again, by definition, and that's the sort of stuff that'll come out over the course of months, years, maybe decades. We do know that obviously the Trump administration being in Washington emboldens right-wing elements across the world, and that certainly should be the case for Bolivia. We also know about the National Endowment for Democracy funding I mentioned earlier, but it's worth noting that the funds that we know of right now are relatively modest. And then the recordings involving ex-military people and opposition politicians, according to all the experts that I spoke to, said do not provide definitive proof of coordination with the U.S. There is mention of talk with Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and other U.S. politicians, but there isn't any sort of indication or definitive proof that there was actual coordination on the ground. Those are different things, it's a different burden of proof. So if there isn't yet evidence of a cleanly coordinated plan, again, it is possible, but there's not yet evidence based on this. What happened? Most experts I have spoken to describe the situation as a right-wing co-opting of a broader popular crisis. There's a legitimacy crisis that happened before the coup, which is why you might find that a significant number of Bolivians across the political spectrum say that this wasn't a coup. Now, I do think that it should be understood as a coup, but it's important to know that people on the right, some people in the center, and some people on the left will not describe it as a coup. I don't really have the time, I don't think, to go into, I only have a few minutes and I don't want to take up too much time about my sort of 2 minutes, a full explanation of the legitimacy crisis. But one One feature of it would, of course, be the referendum that was ignored. It was legal for Morales to run again, but it seems to clearly violate the sort of spirit of Bolivian democracy to run again in defiance of your own term limits and after losing a referendum. Another issue, and I think this is really essential, is that sometimes in some left-wing press, I see sort of caricatures of the protests that went on before Morales was sort of pushed out of power. The protests were not just rich right-wing white Bolivians, but they actually involved people from a wide different swaths of society. They were urban and they were middle class, and there were people who came from, who identified or were perceived as white. There were people who were mestizo, and there were people who were from the what could be called the emerging indigenous middle class, people who might have been the first generation to be middle class, who became that way under Morales' tenure. The social movements, the protests that went on before the election also included students, and also included eventually people from rural areas as well. And it's also key to note that in the final days and the final day that Morales was kicked out of power, we see some key examples of left-wing social movements and his political base pulling away from him, calling for him to resign. Most notably the COVE, which is the largest labor organization in Bolivia, and also the Miners' Union. So this is a crisis that was capitalized on by right-wing forces that may have not been tightly coordinated, as far as we can tell so far, but ultimately converge around similar interests that had already planned to destabilize the situation and were emboldened by circumstances partially caused by the government itself. I don't have time to talk about the pause in the vote count, but I think it's a lot more complicated than most people think it was. It's not just about the statistical plausibility of whether or not the pause in the vote count the pause in the vote count is crucial to understanding the legitimacy crisis, even if there's no evidence of fraud, because it made people who were already primed to question the election en masse start to question the validity of the election itself. I don't have time to get into the current situation. I'd say no doubt the situation is bad heading into May's elections. I'm sure a lot of you know about the authoritarian rule by Janine Áñez and the right-wing policies that she has pursued, including killing dozens of Bolivians in the name of pacifying the country. But on the question of how people can help, I would ask, I would suggest, and I also reached out to a lot of Bolivians before this conversation asked, I would say talk to people on the ground, get in touch with social movements, get involved in human rights efforts, anti-racism efforts, stand for democracy and the rule of law. But the most important thing to do is center the Bolivian experience and embrace it in all its complexity and figure out what people on the ground actually want and need. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zeeshan. Our next speaker is Pamela Calla, an anthropologist from Bolivia who is engaged with issues of gender, race, class, and state formation in Latin America. She is currently a clinical associate professor at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University and received the Dr. Martin Luther King Award in 2016-17 at that same institution. She co-founded the Observatory on Racism in Bolivia, 2007-17, and the Red de Acción y Investigación Antirracista en las Américas, 2010 to present, an initiative launched by the Universidad de la Cordillera and the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, University of Texas.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you all here and all the organizations who have prepared and invited me to give this talk. Sorry. Okay. I was just thanking everybody for having invited us to talk about Bolivia, which is, yeah, as you said, a very important country to discuss. Because of it's hard for me to talk about Bolivia these days because obviously it has affected me and my family and everybody. We were so my personal political position is that it's sort of like the lived experience of coups and occupation from the get-go since I was born, right? I was born after the 1952 revolution, so I know what a coup is, I know what occupation is. This last time, yeah, my family my family is in Bolivia, lives in Bolivia, and in the midst of social convulsion, my dad died. And it was not directly related to the social convulsion, but it was because we couldn't get to doctors. Hospitals were closed. So it's hard. It's hard to sort of like detach myself from what I, even in my political social analysis, it's hard to detach myself from that, and because it's profoundly painful. And I think, I said I was going to compliment you, and I think I will. And I want to say that instead of focusing on whether it was a coup or not, I want to ask how was it that the hegemony of a cultural revolution, Proceso de Cambio led by Morales, our first indigenous president, was broken? Or what was broken? What were the points of rupture that accumulated over 13 years of a 13-year-old period of his administration that led to the crisis of hegemony and its breakdown? So that's my question, to sort of like not get away from the important details that you've discussed, that I think are very important, but to get a more historical perspective, maybe, a more in-depth perspective, not so much a coyuntura perspective. How do you say that in English? Conjunctural perspective, which is important too, because you have to sort of analyze what happens conjuncturally, or whatever the word is. So when I asked that main question about the crisis of hegemony, could we talk then about continuities? Where the Proceso de Cambio turned into something else, where and when? And even before the October elections in 2019, actually started in 2010 when Morales allied with the agro-industry based on the Eastern Lowlands, when the now hated Unión Juvenil Cruceñista was incorporated into the mass youth structure, to the surprise of mass youth organizations that weeks before when this happened were in frontal confrontation. Right? So I'm going back almost to the beginning. The position that argued that there was a coup erases this history of points of rupture between the state and the social groups and organizations that supported Evo, the Evo Morales government at the beginning of his administration, such as the youth organizations and other like the ones that had conformed the Pacto de Unidad, CONAMAC, SIDO, CESUTCB, Bartolinas. A major point of rupture between the state and social organizations occurred in Chaparina, where a big highway was going to construct and destroy indigenous communities in the eastern lowlands of the country, the Tigris Highway. And another major point of rupture occurred between that Pacto de Unidad that supported Evo Morales and CONAMAC and SIDO were the ones that split, and two SIDOs and two CONAMACs, one official and one grassroots was formed. The divide and conquer strategies in El Alto neighborhood organizations. So these points of rupture between organizations and the state over its intensified extractive agenda in detriment of the constitutionalized principle of buen vivir sort of was the reality of that period since 2010. I followed those processes of rupture through the knowledge construction and political action of indigenous women in Conamac and Seramib, Sidon, and new organizations like the Contiocat. These women, indigenous women, came all the way to New York City, to NYU and to the UN to denounce two things. Free prior consultation was not being implemented, and their cuerpos territorios, their body territories, were going to get affected. The social fabric and organizations, their organizations were being menaced by the violence of the extractive agenda represented by the agro-industrial empresarial interests that were regionally based and responded to the energy needs of Brazil and Argentina, but here it was in place. The other thing that they talked about when they were at NYU were that they were protesting and denouncing a repressive strategy, a specific criminalizing law of social organizations, right? So the rights frame of the Bolivian state was already being hollowed out in terms of indigenous territorial rights, Mother Earth rights, and human rights before this now called coup, right? So that's sort of like my point in those terms. I won't go into the details of how univocality and personalism and therefore macho populism were created through the anti-racist unit and the Vice Ministry of Decolonization, which is something that me and the group that formed the Observatorio Racismo really followed up. I'm not going to get into that. But in the state, within the functioning of the state, this is what happened. Sort of like univocality to defend the status quo that in the end served the purpose of making Evo Morales ready for elections. They said that it would be racism, they used the anti-racist law, it would be racism not to let him run as a president for the fourth time. So they instrumentalized the law in that sense. I'm going to drink some water. How much time do I have? So in any case, so the referendum and the no vote for the re-election of Morales and Garcia Linera, and plus the electoral fraud of October 19th, constitute two more moments of rupture when citizens finally break the hegemony achieved by the Cultural Revolution. And this was then a major point of rupture that created the crisis of the state in which we are right now. The position that argues that there was a coup also overshadowed first and then erased the plurality of positions and critical practice of individuals and groups organized in their neighborhoods, rehearsing autonomy and denouncing fraud and the lack of respect towards what had been stated through the 2016 referendum that voted no to the re-election, which coincides with your explorations and interviews. It also overshadowed the experience of independent organizing and resistance among youth and middle classes who were not necessarily part of the right, and who had to defend their households, neighborhoods vis-a-vis the avalanche of pro-mass provocateurs and opposition irregular grupos de choque. So both sides had groups that were doing the choque, right? So it is hard for me to talk about the polarized violence that have led to the installation of an ultra-right evangelist interim government in Bolivia. I'm really affected by that. Nobody wanted that. The question that comes up involved the role of the military and police forces, the role of irregular groups, and the consolidation of a narrative that, in the name of pacification has turned us Bolivians into seditious and terrorists till proven innocent, and not the other way around, right? The images of the military rehearsing and spectacularizing its ritualistic power over the Bolivian population on January 21st and 22, the dates where the resignation letters from ex-president and Vice President Morales and Garcia Linera were going to be heard at the Asamblea Legislativa Plurinacional, stick in my mind, as well as the images of confrontation between the military and the social protesting forces in Sacaba and Sencata, where more than 30 people were killed. The country seems very much militarized, and the military is in emergency mode, given the outfits they purposely wear to state rituals where the president showcases their support. The President Áñez, right? The question is how did it happen so fast, so effectively? Right there. They have the uniforms, they have everything, right? Was it the US? My question. Although I do not deny that the hand, and this I coincide with you, that the hand of the US government was for regime change in Bolivia, nor do I deny that patriarchal imperial interests the US has pushed. The US has in pushing Chinese and Russian capital away from Bolivia and Latin America in general is there. The US does not seem to have moved, no, the US does seem to have moved only a few strings. Those were enough, however, right? So the hand of the US is there. Few strings, yes, but it was there, and those were enough. Here we can speak, sorry, 5 minutes. Here we can speak of continuities in the continuation of a repressive state apparatus and the extractivist economic political agenda. And maybe we could say about, in terms of the continuation of racism, but I'll get into that later. So, does everybody speak Spanish here or not? So I'm going to cite Jorge Verpic. You also cited him. In a recent article, he says that the repressive apparatus that the Áñez government is using now against the population and against those seditious and terrorists of the mass party was created by Morales himself in his 13 years of power over Bolivians. The structure of political persecution and silencing of dissident voices that the mass constructed and displayed during its time in power and over the left, the international left, and no, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not good at translating on the spot. But what he's saying is that the silencing, the repressive apparatus are a continuation. They're not a surprise. They were there before, right? So polarization, and I put that there in that analysis, that polarization is the most effective tool to be able most effective tool to not be able to see new and small alliances, repositionings, everyday forms of resistance, and generation of organizational knowledge, pedagogies and politics of dissidents. Polarization also flattens history and pushes under the rug the points of rupture through which you can see the types of continuities that are carried out from one polarized situation to another. In this case, there's a continuity in the incipient formation of a carceral state coated with a rhetoric of plural nation and vivir bien, but well connected to the demands of extractive global capital through the local agro-industrial interest groups. Continuity of environmental policies and extractivism is is going on right now. And the person from, I have a very short time, but one of the women who came to the UN in 2018 and last year is saying, we are denouncing that the grupos de poder from the Oriente, the agroempresarial groups that until recently were strong allies of the MAS party, are rearticulated around the power of the Ministry of Environmental Issues, and is going to continue with the mega hydroelectric projects, with the major extractivist projects that the MAS government had. So there is a continuation in that too. And she says, I talked to her over the phone, indigenous peoples are tired and decepcionados. How do you translate that? Disappointed. Disappointed. So she concludes that derechos indígenas, indigenous rights, environmental rights, and human rights are connected, and that connection should be taken into account if you're thinking of supporting that kind of organization. I think I'm going to leave it there, except that I really want to mention Eva Copa. Eva Copa is the MAS representative of president of the Senate now. She represents a more how would you say? A more reconciliatory side in that party, and she has been a wonderful force of democratization within the MAS, which has now also fragmented, and we're witnessing that fragmentation, and we're witnessing that that is happening. But anyway, that's my take on it.
Thank you, Pamela. And before opening this up to the audience, I would like to say that I actually think there is more evidence of the United States being involved in this surreptitiously. For one thing, Zeeshan mentioned the National Endowment of Democracy, and there, according to analyst Eva Gollinger, this organization funded the Santa Cruz Civic Committee and its Youth Union, which are the fascists that from the Santa Cruz area that Camacho's from for many years. And there's evidence that U.S. aid provided $84 million to Bolivian opposition groups over the years. I'd like to mention the fact that a number of the Bolivian military were trained in the U.S. School of the Americas, including Williams Kaliman, who is the general who suggested that Evo Morales leave the country. And it must be noted that his democratically elected presidency was not scheduled to end until January 21st, and this happened in November. So these are points. And among other things, OAS, the Organization of American States, which released the big report of fraud with absolutely no evidence to sustain it, is 60% funded by the United States, and that the Center for Economic Policy and Research in Washington did the most detailed statistical analysis establishing that there was no evidence in the OAS report, and showing a tremendous amount of evidence that, in fact, the election results were not fraudulent. And on November 25th, there were 4 members of the U.S. Congress that asked the OAS to respond to very specific questions in the report of the CEPR. On December 2nd, The Guardian also published a letter signed by 98 economists and statisticians asking the OAS to retract its misleading statements about the election, which have contributed to the political conflict and served as one of the most used justifications for the military coup. So yes, I'm not in disagreement at all that there was a lot of social unrest in the country over the issue of Evo Morales running again. However, the U.S. had pre-planned what happened that caused the conditions for the coup to take place. And in fact, there is now recently an article, if I can find it in among all my papers piled up here, that U.S. aid recently, this is a January article, yes, right here, January 10th, U.S. aid arrived in Bolivia to monitor the elections, which is of particular concern to what is coming up in May. And I would like to say that as a person who was part of a delegation monitoring the elections, here's my hat and my badge, in 2014, that I left that process thinking the U.S. had a lot to learn about how to run elections. I would just like to mention a couple of points. The ballots, all paper, are color-coded by party with photographs of the presidential candidates and an area within which you can make a mark indicating your intention to vote for that candidate. The election process is completely open. There's boxes. There are many people with fingerprints. The counting process is an open process in the rooms where you can actually, anybody, and we did, all of us, as part of the international delegation, went from polling site to polling site, not just monitoring how the elections themselves were run, but watching the process of counting the votes afterwards. And each and every ballot is held up, indication if it's a mark of intention, marked in several places, and it's all tallied and signed, and it's just an incredible process. There's no work on the day of the elections. There are no cars on the streets. It's a complete process. And if you don't vote, unless you can establish a very good reason for not voting, you have to pay a fine. So the voter turnout is very high. So I just want to make those observations before we move on to asking you all for input on this subject, which I'm happy to do right now. Yes?
While you were talking, I looked up Bolivia. It has
wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
A fairly high.
Hold on.
You can't hear me? I can't.
No, it won't work on the radio.
It's being filmed for the process.
It has a fairly high GDP. Its GDP is higher than Costa Rica. The literacy rate is quite high. It seems like it's a fairly prosperous country. The largest percentage of the labor force is in the services industry. It's not just agricultural. So the question I have is, what if the political conflict, these are not illiterate people, and if there's a conflict on this scale, then there's got to be huge divisions among this population. Where do those divisions come from?
You want to start us off? Please. I mean, that's a huge question. I guess one way I would approach it is to say that there is, the sort of political energy that brought Morales into power is kind of fueled by a big question of who should be included in the economy, and who should be included in society. And when he took power, it was very much a reversal of a kind of neoliberal state of affairs that enriched a very small portion of the population, primarily of European descent, and sort of shattered that in a number of ways. And one sort of through line in all of this throughout his presidency and now is a question of who should money go to from the economy. There's big battles over, for instance, whether or not revenue that comes from the tremendous natural resources that Bolivia has, most notably natural gas, but lots of sort of minerals as well. Where should the money that comes from those, who should it go to? Who deserves it? And Bolivia has hundreds of years of experiencing the money derived from those resources going to a very small percentage of the population, and Morales kind of like burst that.
46, that's in the middle.
Yeah, so and Morales gets a huge. So he mentioned the fact that inequality is not terrible there, say by regional standards, and under Morales's tenure, the Gini index actually inequality reduced by 19%, which is pretty remarkable, and that's both due to an economy that was well run and also aided by the creation of a robust welfare state and modern infrastructure and so on. But I'm saying in kind of a circuitous way just basically that there's an ongoing sort of class divide and question of who deserves to benefit from the natural resources and the kind of work that people put in the Bolivian economy, and that was at least part of a big part of and of course that's entirely racialized series of projects. And for a lot of the right-wingers in Bolivia who supported the coup, I think the question was the idea of like redirecting resources that had been going, out of their pockets into the pockets of a lot more people than usual.
Yeah, but there is something that I would also add that there was a boom of prices of the raw materials that Bolivia offers to the market. So that's another reason why there was that possibility of redistribution and inclusion of more people through bonuses and sort of like a welfare state type of policies that would benefit people in that way, giving them the money to be able so that kids stay in school, or mothers who have who are going to be women who are going to be mothers have the monetary support to go to the clinic and do that.
In the beginning, also, what Evo Morales did when he nationalized the natural gas resources and determined that the profits should be redistributed to the population was that he radically, and very few people would disagree with this in Bolivia, that in the first years he radically reduced poverty. The reason there's such a high literacy rate is because of his emphasis on education, women's rights. The indigenous population is 2/3 of the population of Bolivia, so it's a very big deal that the indigenous people's rights were established in the Constitution and a plurinational nation was formed. Yes, in the back.
I got it. Yeah. Come just a little closer? Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
What's your name?
My name is Lucy Pagoada Quesada, and I am from Honduras.
Wow.
My heart goes out to the Bolivian people. My sister Calla, I know exactly what you're feeling. I am also a victim of U.S. imperialism in Honduras and in all of Latin America. I think that the situation of Bolivia cannot be seen in isolation. We need to look at it in the context of what has been going on in our region for the past 20 years. The United States has been at war. Our government, the one that we pay taxes, millions of dollars were mentioned before, right? That go out to the wars. Well, part of that war that the United States government has is against progressive governments in our countries. One of them was the progressive government of President Manuel Zelaya Rosales, which the United States government under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton destituted in 2009. And ever since, sister, we have not recuperated our peace. What you see today in the caravans, the exodus of massive people leaving my country, Honduras, along with other countries in the north, so-called North Triangle, is because of instability that our government is producing there. I didn't come to this forum to sugarcoat what is going on, because I am a direct victim of what our government of the United States is doing in our countries. And it's the same thing that is happening against the government of Venezuela. It's the same thing that the United States wants to do to the government of Nicaragua. It's the same thing that the United States has been doing for the past 50 years against the socialist government of Cuba. So let's think about it in a more broader way. Let's look at what is happening in Chile. The uprisings against neoliberalism. That's the war of the people against the system that has been imposed onto us, that hasn't worked out, and that is kicking our people out, destituting them, just having them leave our countries, because there's nothing there for the great majorities. What is there now is for the people like Áñez. First of all, Áñez is not a president. She is a self-proclaimed peliteñida. Nobody elected her. The people of Bolivia did not elect her. So she's not a president. Let's not call her a president, because she's not. So that's the first thing, right? And then after that, we're going to talk about President Evo Morales. I'm not going to take too long, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at this in a larger context. What we have is a war against the people of Latin America. Because of U.S. imperialism, because of U.S. capitalism, because of U.S. failed neoliberalism. This is why the people of Chile are on the streets. This is why the youth of Chile, this is why the people of Ecuador are rising. Because of what's happening. So let's be honest with ourselves. And let's look at how our government is doing with our tax money. When the coup happened in Honduras, I will go there, and on the streets, the tear gas that was thrown at our people said made in the U.S. Right? With my tax money, I'm a teacher here for more than 20 years in this country. I pay a lot of taxes. And to know where my tax money is going to kill my people, let's be honest. Áñez is not there to protect the rights of the Bolivian people. She's there to protect the rights of imperialists and the bourgeoisie like her, who thinks she's a bourgeoisie. But really, honestly, her hair, that's indigenous hair. And she should be ashamed of herself for dyeing her hair blonde. She should be ashamed of herself. She needs to be proud like me and like my sister here with African hair, indigenous hair. That's beautiful hair, not dye hair. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and long live the people of Latin America who resist against U.S. imperialism, against U.S. capitalism, and against U.S. neoliberalism. Thank you very much.
Alright, so I see I've seen this hand for a while, so I'm gonna go to him, and then you, and then her, okay? Oh, okay, so then first you, and then him, and then he's gonna take over for that side of the room. Please stand up. I don't know how far this goes, but it doesn't go that far. Introduce yourself. Say your name, please.
I'm Marcelo. I live in the United States since 2000s. And, I saw many coups in Bolivia. I live under many dictatorships in Bolivia, and I think, it's really dangerous not to define what happened in Bolivia like a coup, because it's a coup. And also, it was not a fraud. The elections were not a fraud. And also, we have to understand that we have here, in 2006, elected the first indigenous president in Bolivia, which never happened before. I would compare this like when we elect Obama for president. And there is a lot of hate of people in Bolivia, especially the people that identify themselves as white, which is a minority. And this minority has been governing Bolivia since many years before. Only this kind of thing was broke when Evo Morales was elected. And then all these white rich people have always access to the resources in Bolivia. and never redistribute all this wealth in Bolivia. Only Evo Morales was able to redistribute all the wealth. And it's something that the rich people resent. And since then, he was attacked. He was always diminished as in a despective way as an Indio. An Indio, a word that we will compare with the N-word in the United States. And I think with the help of the United States, you know, I don't have to remind you what the United States has been doing since Cuba, since El Salvador, and well, a lot of history. And now we have this interim president, which was self-proclaimed, like they say, because when she was self-proclaimed, there was no other quorum in Bolivia, in the Bolivian parliament, so the power was held by the military. So that's a coup. No, she was not elected. And now she promised that she's gonna call for elections. And she's not gonna, and she said, I promise not to run. But now she's running for president. She is a dictator. I just wanna say that. And now I wanna tell you too that since Evo Morales, many people around the world, many Bolivians were voting. They were in, you know, in the United States, in Tokyo, in Argentina. But now, I think we are not going to have these people voting again because the new people that it's in charge of elections say that there's no money to fund that. So it is really problematic, and we can see that this new self-proclaimed woman is just cutting all the civil liberties, and it's really worrying. I just want to say that. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to ask the people who want to ask a question or say something, just come to me, because like this mic is like, but I said he could go next, and then we're going to go to that side of the room, but you'll get a turn, okay? Yeah, stand up. Be heard, say your name.
Yeah, my name is Keith. Yeah, on the question of the indigenous, to follow up on that, it was really striking the open contempt that was shown towards the indigenous population, the ripping off of the on the military part, on their armbands. If you could talk a bit about that, you know, the tremendous hatred and contempt that was unleashed by this coup.
It's painful to talk about that,
but necessary.
I started the Observatory on Racism in Bolivia because we saw similar events when Evo Morales was elected at the beginning of in 2007. We got together with the Ombudsman, the Defensor del Pueblo, and he said, we have to say something about what's going on. And it was similar situations where indigenous women in the Constituent Assembly, and we did the research, were being followed and insulted, and just that sort of insult increased into violence. They were taken by their hair and whatever, right? Because they were indigenous and they were not supposed to be in the Constituent Assembly, right? Their place was somewhere else, not there. So we studied what was going on, and we created these processes of denunciation in the press through the Ombudsman, and then there came a time when 25th of May 2008, the Constituent Assembly was not, the draft of the Constitution was not approved yet, so that the national struggle was there between the Oriente, the eastern part of the country, which was called La Media Luna, where a rightist populist movement had been created, and the sort of progressive forces that were trying to, trying to help build a first indigenous state, right? So that's when 25th of May, people were stripped of their clothes. It was a ritual, like from the margins of the city, they were beaten up, and then little by little they brought them to this main plaza. They stripped them of their upper clothes, and they humiliated them. They made them kneel and sort of like they forced them to say that they were against the Mass Party and against Evo Morales and whatever. That triggered a whole process of social mobilization against that, and therefore an emergent social movement that was anti-racist specifically. So we got together with, not only with the Ombudsman, but all kinds of organizations, and forged this anti-racist movement. What happened there? And that's what I didn't talk about before. Like, we all believed that the state should back this process through legislative agendas and through public policy agendas. And that was done. But once we did that, and once at the national level, as I said before, there were these pactos, how do you say pactos? Pacts between the government and the business interests of people in the eastern lowlands, the agribusiness that I was talking about. When those pacts were being done, right before the new constitution was approved, then all our efforts were starting to be sort of like appeased. Okay, you were part of an anti-racist movement. We're gonna have within the state, within the Vice Ministry of Decolonization, an anti-racist unit, and we're going to have a comité de lucha contra el racismo y toda forma de discriminación. So we gathered there and we believed in that. We merged our sort of movement and our interest in align with the state because we really believed in that a legislative agenda was going to help that process, right? A public policy agenda in schools, everywhere else was going to help that process. What happened that was co-opted, and nothing was achieved through that. Yes, there is a law, there was some public policy, and there was some actions in schools, but mostly the status quo was more important to defend than other things. So state work around racism got paralyzed, right? And so when you saw all those things in the press, people being sort of dragged into the streets. That woman who was the mayor of Vinto, right? It was outrageous. But then, I'm sorry, these are just long projects. But then, when you think, right, in the 13, 14-year period, that legislative process, that public policy process should have been sort of pushed, and real education, real implementation of the law would have occurred, and it didn't. So you come a situation of crisis, and this thing happens again. It's not prepared, it's the same. Feminicides have increased, and during the Evo Morales government, feminicide statistics rose up to the sky. Why hasn't the government of Evo Morales went right to the matter, right?
Yeah, there is a law.
there is a law, but no implementation, no resources for an implementation. So it's that. There's a gap in terms of implementation of policy that doesn't allow that it didn't work. And so I understand the outrageousness, but at the same time.
So I want us to be mindful that Pamela and Zeeshan are our guests, and we want to listen to them. We also want to be mindful that there are questions, and we want to get to them. Yes. So, if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Could I just add one comment on that as well, on the issue of racism?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so, this is not nearly as profound as what Pamela had to say, but I think the one thing that is striking to me and that I've thought about is the extraordinary precarity and tentativeness of racial progress that has been made in Bolivia, and the fact that so many people I spoke to in Bolivia will talk about how their lives were transformed by him taking power. In terms, there is the symbolic element, and then there's also the legal side of things. The symbolic being, of course, the first indigenous president in the country, in a place where indigenous people have been brutally repressed and marginalized. It is just an extraordinary thing to see someone take power who really represents an exploited majority. So that was a huge thing. And then on top of that, you have the policy side of things. I've talked about the economic policies that were more inclusive, but there's also sets of laws that were meant to prevent racial discrimination, access to businesses, for example. One story I heard over and over again from people from all kinds of different backgrounds where, like, oh, I would be in a shop and an indigenous woman in a traditional pollera skirt would say, if I were to come into here, before Morales was elected, I could have just been thrown out. If some white person said, I don't want them in here, they're filthy, they're dirty, and they could literally get kicked out. In those exact same spaces now, indigenous people are opening up their own shops and these things. And that's a huge sort of difference. So, and along with these things and certain prohibitions on expressions of public racism, you create a new public culture of certain kinds of what could be called a kind of political correctness. And it's amazing that when you have a crack in this kind of system and when you have an opportunity for the right to come in, how quickly so much of that unravels. Now, all the legal and economic stuff hasn't all completely come apart yet, but the cultural side of it has shown through. We've seen a lot of vicious, just horrendous racism being expressed, and it's amazing. And there's a debate on the left about how much should we care about interpersonal racism versus institutional or systemic. And I'm often, against false dichotomies, and I think in these situations they feed off of one another. So if you have a resurgence in racism and popular culture in Bolivia, well, that'll help provide a great foundation for taking away the legal or economic rights of the majority and disenfranchising them again, right? So it's all very scary. That's the conclusion.
Thank you. Wait, hold on.
I just would like to say a couple of things. One is I was part of my training, and there's somebody else in this room I saw come in who was there in Bolivia with me, was in an elementary school in El Alto where I saw that the Quechua language was being taught in the schools. Quechua and Aymara are the two indigenous languages of the area. That's a big change from before Evo Morales became president. Another thing in terms of racism, not just the wifala being torn, which is the indigenous flag being torn off the uniforms of the police, but Camacho saying that Pachamama will never again enter the White House the presidential palace, excuse me, on the day that Evo Morales was forced to leave the country, and Anya's talking about satanic rights of the indigenous people. If this isn't racism, what is?
I just wanted to add that, I talked about the continuity of the extractive agenda of the Morales' government in this government, the continuity of the repressive apparatus and whatever. And I really think that in that extractivist agenda, in the Morales' during the Morales' government, and in the extractive agenda that is continuing now, there is racism.
All right, so this is what we're gonna do going forward with questions. So we're gonna take the questions from that side. Can you get 3 questions before we shoot it over to our speakers? This way we just make sure that everyone's getting, or more people are getting their questions asked, or getting to ask their questions. Make sure questions. Yeah, questions.
Hello. Okay.
And then we're gonna speak over here.
Alright. Buenas noches. Hi, good evening. My name is Maria Teresa. I am a diasporic Bolivian. Soy boliviana diaspórica. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. My question is a little more specific, and it's for Pamela. You mentioned, and this is the first I'm hearing of it, so if you could offer more information, that'd be great. The little bit that I've seen of Unión Juvenil Cruceñista is frightening. I don't know a lot about them, but the little bit that I've seen is very scary. And I had not heard before your presentation today about how the MAS government has sort of reached out, I think if I'm expressing correctly, and sort of made friends with them, so to speak. If you could expand on that a little bit, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
All right, so 2 more questions.
Hi, buenas noches. Hi, Pamela. You two gave great presentations about what has happened up until now with the coup. My question is, what is going to happen now with the elections in May?
All right, 1 more question.
Hello, Nat. Thank you for the complex view you have given. My question is regarding geopolitics. I have heard a lot about U.S. imperialism, but what I have lived in Bolivia is that South America is a more complicated place right now than it was during the Cold War. It's not just U.S. I mean, South America is China imperialism, capitalism imperialism, Brazilian imperialism, and what I know as a historian about coups in South America is that normally when U.S. have intervened directly is because they have direct interests. I mean, I don't know what to say about that in Bolivia. I know that agribusiness is completely related to Brazil. Most lands are bought by Brazilian land investors and landholders. I think, from my perspective, I can see something more related to that. But I really think that if we don't talk about China in the context of Bolivia, I mean, we are not talking about geopolitics, really.
So, Pamela, I will let you address the first question. This is directed at you, and I'm sure you can handle it better than I can. The second question was regarding elections. Oh yeah, what's going to happen now? Yeah. So, you know, I certainly am not in the business of making predictions, but right now the trends that we're seeing politically is the polling suggests that we may end up in a scenario where, well, so the MAS is polling higher than sort of any other political candidate or party right now. And if current trends continue, what I've spoken to a lot of political scientists about this, the scenario that I heard mapped out for me a lot was that come May, assuming that things aren't totally rigged, and we can get into that conversation as well, but assuming the elections are run more or less in a somewhat reasonable way, the MAS could win the first round, but not win by enough of a margin in order to avoid a runoff. And the reason for that would be they would, you know, not necessarily breach the 40% mark or win by a 10% margin. And what that would mean is the MAS would face off against the second place winner in the first round, and it would be a head-to-head between the top 2 winners of the first round. And in that scenario, again, based on what was been conveyed to me, it seems that it's quite likely that the MAS will lose in that scenario. Specifically, the reason that would happen is right now the right would be split between a number of candidates, and then when you have, presumably, if they all unite, then they would unite behind one candidate, or it would be behind the centrist Carlos Mesa if he happens to win number 2. But there are so many new political currents, it's hard to make predictions about what turnout will look like for, you know, the two hard right figures were just not nearly as prominent or virtually unknown prior to this moment. So it's very difficult to make predictions, and also polling can be inaccurate with the rural areas as well. So that seems to be sort of a scenario, and I guess from the perspective, from a left perspective, I guess if the MAS were to lose, the situation that would be more stable and not catastrophic would be if Carlos Mesa, who has lots of issues but at least is a centrist, and then a lot of people fear the idea of Áñez or Camacho winning, which could be truly, I mean, as we've already seen signs of, catastrophic. So that's kind of the scenario that I see gaming out right now. The question of whether or not the elections will be held fairly, you know, when I'm talking to, you know, a variety of different experts, there tends to be obviously a variety of concerns, and there, for instance, there's lawsuits that are being launched against Luis Arce, who's going to represent the MAS. He was Morales' former finance minister, a very kind of savvy technocrat, and there's whole questions of whether or not the legal battles against him are meant to restrict his movement, and if they make it harder for him to campaign, can you say the MAS got a fair shot at the election, for example? There's also questions of what will happen with state funds, which Morales abused all the time when he was in power. What's going to happen with Áñez? How will she use state resources, things like that. So there's questions over those things. And I'll take the third question just really quickly. I'll just convey the point that Linda Farthing pointed out to me, that she thinks that Brazil had a hand in this. I don't know if I'd say she's certain, but she says that, you know, basically you have natural gas. Bolivian natural gas is extremely important for Sao Paulo, running the city basically, and it's in their interest to sort of tip things in their favor. And so I think you're making a good point about the fact that there's various vectors of influence in South America, and again, there's an ongoing discussion about what the US influence was, but there's other actors as well that are kind of flexing their muscles in different ways, and that's a sad sort of general eternal reality of being a poor but resource-rich state, is that you are just sort of at the mercy of more influential powers, you know, exploiting you for personal gain.
Yeah, I think imperial reconfigurations are going on, like in a mega way, and I you know, I wouldn't surprise that China said the other day, the ambassador from China said, we're going to work with any government. Whoever is elected, we're going to work with them. And then I feel that the US, because of its interests, is going to work better and more effectively with the ultra-right at this point in the history of this country, because that's the kind of empire that they're building. But these pugnas are real, and I think we have to take them into account. Russia has to be taken into account too, and of course Brazil at a more regional level. In relation to the Juventud Cruceñista, yeah, la Juventud Cruceñista and la ¿cómo se llama? La Juventud Cochala? Resistencia Cochala are, yes, irregular groups that are rightist groups, are part of that amalgama of youth that are being used to create havoc, to push that racist agenda, to push the violent racist agenda of the right at that extreme level, I think. And yes, the observatory was studying what happened in Santa Cruz, what happened with the youth organizations, and why the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, being what it was incorporated into the youth structures. And it was a very sort of like, the conclusion is that they had to accept the Unión Cruceñista with no questioning, because the silencing process that I talked about was going on already. So there it is. But it is a fact. We wrote about it, and if you want, I can give you more information about that. What's going to happen? I think they...
Hey, Pamela, you have so many important points, but there's so many hands raised, and I want to make sure we get some more people. Will you be available afterwards? For a bit? Just a bit? Okay, everybody remember that, okay?
Very briefly, on the question of geopolitics, yes, China, other countries, Brazil are definitely involved, but we live in this country, so I think our responsibility as North Americans is to understand better what our country is doing. That's part of it, and what we can do to stand up for the rights of, for international law. And I don't think any discussion of natural resources in Bolivia is complete without mentioning the word lithium. 1/3 of lithium is in Bolivia, and Tesla, not to mention other companies, are clearly very interested in developing this resource.
All right, quick note, if you filled out Move the Money campaign cards, he's gonna come around and collect them. Thank you. All right, and so now we're gonna take 5 more questions to throw at you guys. So you, her, you. No, oh, no, okay, so you, and you.
All right, my name is Pablo. One key important point that we didn't mention here was that about 70% of population in Bolivia are indigenous. It was just making sense that indigenous president was. And what happened there was the racism that I lived when I was a kid, and I don't know if you were there. You have, right? And you can agree with me that over there, calling the cholas was a regular thing to say. It was racism in ourselves from the beginning. When Evo Morales went to the presidency, he changed that. Indigenous people was respected, and they have a place. That's what he did. And some other people, the whites or the people with privilege, they weren't accepting that. And that's what happened. They just wait until the moment that he was weak to get out of the power, and that's what happened. That's when the racism won in my country.
You're making really great points, really important points, but we want people to ask questions, and they'll be available for a bit afterwards. All right, thank you so much, though.
Hi, thank you everyone for really informative stuff. So one question,
I can't hear you.
Sorry. So one question that keeps coming up for me that I really haven't seen addressed in the media or by anyone who's talking about this, just why was it necessary for Morales to even try this thing with the referendum and running for an additional term in the first place? Assuming that, assuming all the worst about U.S. intentions, which we know that they have a history of this, right? And assuming that the right had this hatred of him, try to unseat him, but knowing that they would take any opportunity to make any accusation of electoral fraud and incipient dictatorship. Why take the risk, especially after having ruled for so long? Was there really no, other successor or anyone else in MAS that could have taken up his mantle? Why even pull this sort of very risky and attention grabbing maneuver, even if we can make the case that there wasn't fraud and it was all legitimate? And does this
So your question is, why would people take the risk?
Well, yeah, why was it necessary?
Why did Morales take the risk of the referendum?
Right.
Yeah, okay, so we got that question down. Who's after you? Thank you so much for your question. We wanted to get them answered.
Just a quick comment, but I'm gonna make my question. As a Colombian American, I feel very affected what happened to Bolivia, just because Bolivia is named after our liberator Simón Bolívar. You know? So we have to always be connected. That Bolivia is a daughter of Bolívar. You know, and I guess my question pertains towards, just to give a little bit of historical context, how does the Monroe Doctrine play into this? Just for the fact that you say it's bigger than the coup, and of course, because we have to put the Monroe Doctrine into play. Just like last year when John Bolton said, he reenacted the Monroe Doctrine when he was talking about taking Chinese and Russian influence out of Latin America. So we need to talk about this. You know, for me, I feel like the Monroe Doctrine is collapsing just because they had a failed coup in Venezuela. And there's 1 year of that failed coup. That's right. 1 year. So that means that the Monroe Doctrine is falling and Bolivar is rising once again.
Woohoo!
Hello. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Peace. And it's a wonderful, informative for me, being Pakistani. My name is Shahid Comrade, and I'm a Secretary General of Pakistan USA Freedom Forum. Thank you, Mrs. Zeeshan, for your very honest report without going to any other side. But one side is very clear. My country, White House, CIA, and Pentagon is a criminal. And if you see any problem in Palestine, Kashmir, at this moment in India, in Africa, it's our responsibility. But one thing, Professor, I will ask you. Please guide us that how we can learn from the history. Very earlier it happened in Honduras. We never learned that how these capitalist warmongers work. We never learn how what's happening in Venezuela. So my point is only that if you are elected by the people, doesn't matter what kind of you are, we should have to as actors stand for the people's right, civil government. You are not the only person God sent you to save your country. That's the message to every person who's elected in my country, Pakistan, in Africa. You are not born to rule forever.
That's a really great point and a really good question. Thank you. All right, so his question was, how can we learn from our history? So I think those might be the last round of questions, but they will be here while we're clearing up. So let's let them answer these questions. We have like 5 minutes left. So let them answer these questions, and they'll be hanging out while we're clearing up. So you guys feel free to talk to them.
Miss, because you said to me, so I just wanted one thing. No.
Okay, so I'll take the first 2 questions. Since we have 5 minutes, I'll be quick. On the question of the referendum, you know, why do that? Or I assume the question was kind of like, why run again after the referendum failed? Yes. Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered the question as you were asking, which is that I think you hinted at it at least, that there's a problem with cultivating younger talent within the party, and then when you have, this is a kind of pitfall of having an extraordinarily charismatic politician, is that you start to develop, I mean, you can have cult of personality. I don't want to say that everyone who liked Morales was part of this cult, but it does generate that kind of tendency. And one thing I noticed when I was walking around Bolivia a lot was how often I could see Morales' face. And I kept thinking, what happens when he leaves power? You know, it's not the MAS, it's not the left, it's Morales. And you have, and I think this is part of the problem that happened with the weakness and the vacuum that was left after Hugo Chavez passed as well. Because you had a really wooden, not very effective politician try to fill up the space left by an extraordinary politician. So you have a case of a charismatic politician, you're not grooming talent, you have every incentive to kind of keep leaning into it, and then at one point in time you eventually start to say, we're going to either have to give up power because we haven't done enough of the work to build in the new generation of talent, or you kind of like try to, you know, nudge things your way. Yeah, that's the sort of sad reality, and I think that's the real important thing for the masses to to invest in that next generation, which there are signs of already, but needs to be done more consistently. The other point, I'm not equipped to talk in depth about the Monroe Doctrine and in a rigorous way right now, but there was a point made about the fact that you know, is it collapsing or you know, things are less effective. Yeah, I think that's a point worth making. Like the coup, the attempted coup, US-backed coup in Venezuela failed for a number of reasons, and part of that is, at least if we're going to talk about from the perspective of the US, is also incompetence in the Trump administration. And that's the great thing about the current government. So, yeah, there's just these very half-hearted attempts to kind of pull off these maneuvers. Sorry?
Go ahead, I'm sorry. I heard you.
Oh, okay. To undermine the Venezuelan regime, and then it didn't. It was pulled off very poorly. You know, Bolton and Pompeo and all the rest are a total mess, and so it just didn't work out. And so I think that would probably figure into, again, this sort of ongoing debate about U.S. involvement, is that you can be involved, the U.S. can be involved in what's going on in Bolivia, but there's also a question of how much involvement there was, how much money, how many, you know, arms, how much coordination there was. There's a lot of questions about degree and quantity that should shape any sophisticated analysis of what was involved. So obviously, it goes without saying that the U.S., particularly under Trump, but even if it wasn't under Trump, would be on the side of either neoliberalism or hard right, insofar as it backed U.S. geopolitical concerns in Latin America or in Bolivia. But yeah, I mean, there's questions of competence and interest as well, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, you know, I think the person who talked about racism and privilege, you're right. I mean, it is the privileges of upper white classes that were questioned with Evo Morales when Evo Morales came to power, and it hasn't changed that much. And that's we as Bolivians have to keep on working on that as a society, and not only through the state and the legislative and whatever processes, but through our own action amongst us. I agree with you in terms of the party and how it shaped and how that univocality was forged and personalism was affirmed, and therefore, you know, you needed this sort of very strong leadership to be able to implement and carry out the extractive agenda, right? And Evo Morales was there to do that. I think for the intensification of the extractive agenda, you needed a macho populist, and that's what happened. And I think in terms of the party, the fact that the party was not able to sort of like replace Evo Morales, I think it has a lot to do with patriarchy. With patriarchy itself, because we are still, that kind of party representation hasn't been questioned. And that was one of the October agendas 2013, despartidización de la sociedad, de todo ese proceso político. And we never did it. And mass enter in it as a party. And I just want to say
Pamela,
that,
I'm really
no, just one thing. The indigenous women I work with are very courageous. They are the ones who started just saying, you know, he's not doing this, he's not doing the consultations, the free prior consultations. He's implementing laws that criminalize us as people with rights to protest. So they, in Tipnis and wherever else, they slow down patriarchy in the form of the mass party this time, in the form of the state. So I think I would ally with those women, and I would sort of, since there's a continuation of that agenda now, we have to support those women and those organizations.
Thank you. I thank both of you, and I just would like to end on a note of remembrance of Sebastián Moro, who is an Argentinian journalist who was murdered by the coup perpetrators on November 10th. And for all the other journalists who've been tear gassed, and one woman recently, I don't know if either of you remember her name, but I couldn't find my paper, who continued to report despite having tear gas thrown in her face recently. Teresa. Yes, yes, thank you. And the television manager who was handcuffed and forced to wear a jacket and put on in public as an independent television station was shut down. And that this is the repression of independent media that's going on now within Bolivia. So on that note, Please continue to talk to our two speakers while we quickly pack up because we have to be out of here by 9:30. And I want to thank you all for coming and very much for your participation.